Friends, I want you to close your eyes for a moment and think about the most quoted Bible verse of our generation. If you've spent any time in Christian circles, on social media, or even in greeting card aisles, you've seen it. It's been printed on coffee mugs, embroidered on pillows, and shared millions of times across every platform imaginable. "For I know the plans I have for you," declares the Lord, "plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you hope and a future." Jeremiah 29:11. The verse that launched 1,000 graduation speeches. The promise that comforted countless people through difficult seasons. The scripture that built an entire industry of inspirational merchandise. But what if I told you that for nearly 2,000 years, we've been getting this verse spectacularly wrong? What if the way we've been using it actually contradicts everything the prophet Jeremiah was trying to communicate? What if our misunderstanding has robbed us of something far more powerful than what we thought we had? Today, we're going to journey back 26 centuries to discover what this verse really means. We're going to meet the people who first heard these words, understand the devastating circumstances that prompted them, and uncover a truth so profound that it will revolutionize how you see God's promises, your own struggles, and the very nature of hope itself. This isn't about tearing down something beautiful. This is about discovering something infinitely more beautiful than we ever imagined. Because when we understand what Jeremiah 29:11 actually means, it doesn't just change how we read one verse, it transforms how we understand the heart of God. The misunderstanding of this verse has created what scholars call prosperity theology light. A watered-down version of the health and wealth gospel that promises believers a life of blessing and success. It has led to spiritual confusion when reality doesn't match expectation, causing people to question God's faithfulness when their lives don't unfold according to their interpretation of His promise. It has created a generation of believers who are unprepared for suffering, who see hardship as evidence of God's absence rather than His presence, who measure God's love by their circumstances rather than by His character. But the real meaning of Jeremiah 29:11 offers something far more substantial than a divine insurance policy against difficulty. It offers a framework for understanding how God works in the world, how He accomplishes His purposes through human history, and how individual lives fit into His cosmic plan. It provides a theology of hope that can sustain us not just in good times, but especially in seasons of confusion, loss, and apparent defeat. To understand Jeremiah 29:11, we must first understand Jeremiah 29:1. And to understand that, we need to travel back to one of the darkest moments in Jewish history, the Babylonian Exile. Picture Jerusalem in 597 BC. The city that had stood as God's chosen dwelling place for 4 centuries was now a smoldering ruin. The Temple of Solomon, that magnificent structure that had taken 7 years to build and had housed the presence of God for over 300 years, lay in rubble. The walls that had protected the city were broken down, the gates burned with fire. But to truly understand the magnitude of this destruction, we need to appreciate what Jerusalem represented to the Jewish people. This wasn't just their capital city, it was the center of their universe. Jerusalem was where God had chosen to place His name, where His glory dwelt between the cherubim in the Holy of Holies. The temple wasn't just a religious building, it was the meeting place between heaven and earth, the point where the finite touched the infinite. The destruction of Jerusalem represented the collapse of everything the Jewish people understood about their relationship with God. For over 4 centuries, they had operated under a covenant theology that connected God's blessing with the land, the city, and the temple. They believed that as long as they remained in the promised land, as long as the temple stood, as long as sacrifices were offered according to the law, they were secure in God's favor. The Babylonian invasion shattered this theology completely. King Nebuchadnezzar wasn't just conquering territory. He was systematically dismantling a worldview. When his armies besieged Jerusalem, they weren't just attacking a city. They were challenging the supremacy of the God of Israel. When they burned the temple, they weren't just destroying a building. They were making a theological statement about the powerlessness of the Jewish God. The destruction of buildings, as devastating as that was, paled in comparison to the human tragedy. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had systematically deported the Jewish people from their homeland. This wasn't a voluntary relocation. This was the violent uprooting of an entire civilization. The Babylonian deportation strategy was brilliantly cruel. Rather than simply killing conquered populations, they transplanted them to foreign lands, where they would be forever disconnected from their cultural and religious roots. This policy served multiple purposes. It prevented rebellions by removing potential leaders from their power base. It provided skilled labor for Babylonian projects, and it psychologically devastated conquered peoples by severing their connection to everything that gave their lives meaning. The deportations happened in waves. The first occurred in 605 BC, when Daniel and his friends were taken. The second larger deportation happened in 597 BC, when King Jehoiachin and 10,000 of the leading citizens were carried away. The final deportation came in 586 BC, when Jerusalem was finally destroyed, and the remaining population was scattered. Imagine being torn from everything you've ever known. Imagine watching your neighbors, your family members, your religious leaders being marched away in chains to a foreign land over 500 miles away. Imagine the journey itself, months of walking through desert terrain, carrying what little you could manage, watching the weak fall by the wayside. The journey to Babylon was designed to break the spirit of the captives. They walked in chains across hundreds of miles of harsh terrain, often in the heat of summer or the cold of winter. Many died along the way, the elderly, the sick, the very young. Those who survived arrived in Babylon physically exhausted, emotionally traumatized, and spiritually devastated. When the Jewish exiles arrived in Babylon, they found themselves in a world that couldn't have been more different from home. Where Jerusalem was built on hills, Babylon sprawled across flat plains crisscrossed by canals and irrigated fields. Where Jerusalem's temple pointed to heaven with its simple, austere design, Babylon's ziggurats towered over the landscape, decorated with glazed bricks in brilliant blues and yellows, celebrating gods with names like Marduk and Ishtar. Babylon was not just a different place. It was a different kind of place entirely. Jerusalem had been a modest city by ancient Near Eastern standards, focused on worship and religious life. Babylon was a cosmopolitan metropolis, one of the largest cities in the world, a center of international trade, learning, and culture. Its hanging gardens were considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Its ziggurat, the Tower of Babel of biblical memory, dominated the skyline as a testament to human ambition and divine defiance. The cultural shock was immense. Where Hebrew prayers had echoed through familiar streets, now foreign languages filled the air with foreign ideas. Where the weekly Sabbath had marked time with rest and worship, now the Babylonian calendar imposed different rhythms of work and festival. Where Jewish law had governed daily life with its emphasis on purity and separation, now Babylonian customs encouraged integration and assimilation. But perhaps most challenging of all was the religious environment. Babylon didn't just practice different religions, it practiced a form of religious syncretism that welcomed all gods as expressions of deeper divine realities. To Babylonian thinking, the Jewish God was simply another deity in the vast pantheon of divine beings, no more and no less significant than any other national god. The very exclusivity that was central to Jewish faith, the belief that their God was the only true God, was seen as narrow-minded provincialism. The psychological trauma was immense. These weren't just refugees. They were people whose entire understanding of God had been shattered. For generations, they had believed that God dwelt in Jerusalem, that the temple was his house, that the land of Israel was his special possession. They had understood their identity in terms of their relationship to the land, their connection to the temple, their participation in the covenant community. Now all of that was gone. Had God abandoned them? Had he been defeated by the Babylonian gods? Were his promises empty after all? If God was truly all-powerful, why had he allowed his city to be destroyed, his temple to be burned, his people to be carried away into exile? And if he was truly all-loving, how could he permit such suffering to fall upon those who called themselves by his name? These weren't abstract theological questions. They were existential crises that threatened the very foundation of faith. Some of the exiles concluded that God had indeed been defeated, that the Babylonian gods were more powerful, that their ancestral faith had been a delusion. Others maintained their belief in God's existence, but questioned his character, wondering if he was cruel, capricious, or simply indifferent to human suffering. This is the world into which Jeremiah writes his famous letter, not to comfortable believers looking for a motivational boost, but to broken people who had lost everything and were questioning whether God even existed, let alone whether he had good plans for them. Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet, and when you understand his ministry, you see why. For over 40 years, he had watched his nation spiral toward destruction. For 4 decades, he had warned about the coming judgment, pleaded with people to turn back to God, and watched as his words fell on deaf ears. Jeremiah's ministry began around 627 BC, during the reign of King Josiah, when he was probably still a teenager. He witnessed Josiah's reforms, which seemed to promise a spiritual awakening in Judah. The young king had torn down pagan altars, destroyed idols, and re-established proper temple worship. For a brief moment, it appeared that the nation might escape the judgment that God had long threatened. But Josiah's death in 609 BC marked the beginning of the end. His successors, first Jehoahaz, then Jehoiakim, then Jehoiachin, and finally Zedekiah, systematically undid his reforms and led the nation back into idolatry and injustice. Jeremiah watched helplessly as everything Josiah had accomplished was dismantled, as the brief hope for spiritual renewal was replaced by an even deeper descent into corruption. The personal cost of Jeremiah's ministry was enormous. God had forbidden him to marry or have children, symbolic of the coming destruction that would make family life impossible. He was repeatedly threatened, imprisoned, and persecuted by the very people he was trying to save. His message of coming judgment made him deeply unpopular, earning him the hatred of political leaders, religious officials, and ordinary citizens alike. But perhaps most painfully, Jeremiah had to watch as his prophecies came true. He had predicted the Babylonian invasion, the destruction of Jerusalem, the burning of the temple, and the exile of the people. As each terrible event unfolded exactly as he had foretold, Jeremiah felt not vindication, but heartbreak. He had spoken God's words not because he wanted to be proven right, but because he desperately hoped to be proven wrong through his people's repentance. He wasn't a detached observer of the exile. He was a man whose heart was breaking for his people. When Jerusalem fell, Jeremiah wept. When he saw the survivors struggling in the ruins, he wept. When he thought about those carried away to Babylon, he wept. The Book of Lamentations, traditionally attributed to Jeremiah, gives us a glimpse into the depth of his grief. "My eyes fail from weeping. I am in torment within. My heart is poured out on the ground because my people are destroyed. But Jeremiah was also a man who knew God intimately. Through all the tears, through all the apparent defeat, through all the evidence that seemed to suggest God had given up on his people, Jeremiah held on to something deeper. He understood that God's love for his people transcended their circumstances, their unfaithfulness, even their suffering. Jeremiah's theology was shaped by a profound understanding of God's character. He knew that God was not merely the tribal deity of the Jewish people, but the sovereign Lord of all nations. He understood that God's judgments were not arbitrary expressions of anger, but necessary consequences of moral choices. He grasped that God's love was not sentimental tolerance of sin, but a holy love that would do whatever was necessary to restore his people to righteousness. This theological framework allowed Jeremiah to see the exile not as evidence of God's abandonment, but as evidence of God's faithfulness to his covenant. The exile was not punishment for its own sake, but discipline designed to accomplish restoration. It was not the end of God's plan, but a painful but necessary step in its fulfillment. Now, imagine being Jeremiah and hearing reports from Babylon. The exiles were struggling not just with homesickness, but with a crisis of faith. False prophets had risen among them, promising quick deliverance, easy answers, and swift return to Jerusalem. These voices were telling the people exactly what they wanted to hear. This is temporary. God will bring you home within 2 years. Don't settle in. Don't build. Don't invest in this place. Just wait for the miracle. The false prophets in Babylon were not necessarily insincere. They may have genuinely believed their own messages, but their theology was dangerously flawed. They operated from a superficial understanding of God's promises that failed to account for the depth of the nation's sin and the scope of God's purposes. They offered hope without repentance, restoration without transformation, blessing without character change. Their message was seductive because it promised what everyone wanted: a quick return to the way things were before the exile. It appealed to nostalgia, to the natural human desire to avoid dealing with difficult realities. It offered the comfort of believing that their current suffering was meaningless, a temporary interruption that would soon be resolved. But this false hope was actually preventing the exiles from dealing constructively with their situation. Instead of learning what God wanted to teach them through the exile, they were simply waiting for it to end. Instead of allowing their suffering to produce growth, they were treating it as an unfortunate accident. Instead of seeking God's purposes in their circumstances, they were demanding that He change their circumstances to match their preferences. Jeremiah knew these false prophets were not just wrong, they were dangerous. Their lies were preventing the people from dealing with reality, from processing their grief, from learning what God wanted to teach them through this experience. Worse, they were setting the people up for even deeper despair when their promised quick fix didn't materialize. The false prophets were also undermining the theological work that the exile was meant to accomplish. God was using this season of displacement to purge His people of their tendency toward idolatry, to teach them that He was not confined to the temple in Jerusalem, to prepare them for a broader understanding of their calling as a light to the nations. The false prophet's message of imminent return was short-circuiting this process. So Jeremiah did something that took enormous courage. He wrote a letter to the exiles that told them the exact opposite of what they wanted to hear. He told them the truth, even though he knew it would be painful. He told them to settle in Babylon, to build houses, to plant gardens, to have children and give their children in marriage. He told them their exile would last not 2 years, but 70 years. The letter, recorded in Jeremiah 29, was radical in its implications. Jeremiah was telling the exiles to do more than simply accept their situation. He was telling them to embrace it. Building houses implied a long-term commitment to their new location. Planting gardens suggested investment in productivity and beauty, even in exile. Having children and arranging marriages meant creating a future in Babylon, establishing roots that would last for generations. Most shocking of all, Jeremiah told them to seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. He was instructing them to work for the good of their captors, to invest in the success of the very empire that had destroyed their homeland. This wasn't just acceptance of their circumstances. This was active participation in God's larger purposes. The 70-year timeline was particularly devastating. Most of them would never see Jerusalem again. Their children might not see Jerusalem again. Only their grandchildren would experience the return they so desperately longed for. For a people whose entire identity was tied to the land of Israel, this was tantamount to announcing the death of their national hopes. But the 70-year period was not arbitrary. In Leviticus 26, God had warned that if his people persisted in disobedience, the land would enjoy the Sabbath rests it had been denied during their occupation. Chronicles tells us that the exile lasted until the land had enjoyed its 70 Sabbath years. The exile was not just punishment, it was restoration, allowing the land itself to recover from centuries of misuse. Moreover, the 70-year period served important purposes in God's larger plan. It was long enough to allow a new generation to emerge that would be shaped by exile, rather than by the corrupt practices that had led to exile. It was long enough for the exiles to develop a form of faith that was not dependent on the temple, the land, or the religious establishment. It was long enough for them to become a diaspora community that could eventually spread throughout the ancient world, preparing the way for the global expansion of God's kingdom. It was in this context, after delivering this devastating news, that Jeremiah penned the words we know as Jeremiah 29:11. These weren't words written to successful people looking for God's blessing on their already good lives. These were words written to people who had just been told that their worst nightmare was going to last the rest of their lives. Try to put yourself in the sandals of those exiles as they heard Jeremiah's letter read aloud. You've already lost everything. You've been clinging to the hope that God would rescue you quickly, that this nightmare would soon be over. You've been listening to prophets who promised that within 2 years you'd be home. And now comes this letter from Jeremiah telling you that not only will you never go home, but you should stop hoping to go home. You should build houses in this foreign land. You should plant gardens that will take years to mature. You should raise children who will grow up as foreigners, who will marry foreigners, who will call this place home. The emotional devastation would have been complete. It would have felt like the final nail in the coffin of their faith. If Jeremiah was right, then God wasn't coming to rescue them. He wasn't going to perform a mighty miracle. He wasn't going to vindicate their faith in front of their captors. And it's right here, in this moment of absolute despair, that Jeremiah delivers the words that have become the most quoted verse in modern Christianity. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you hope and a future. Can you feel the tension? Can you imagine how those words must have landed? Here were people who had been harmed. They had lost their homes, their freedom, their homeland. Here were people whose prosperity had been stripped away. They were now servants in a foreign land. Here were people whose hope had been crushed. They had just been told their exile would last 70 years. And into that devastation, God speaks words of promise. But notice, he doesn't promise to change their circumstances immediately. He doesn't promise to undo their suffering. He doesn't promise quick relief or easy answers. What he promises is far more profound than that. The Hebrew word for plans here is mashashava. It means thoughts, intentions, purposes. It's the same word used in Psalm 139 when David declares that God's thoughts toward him are precious and innumerable. It's the word used in Isaiah 55 when God says his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. This isn't casual planning. This is deep, intentional, careful design. In ancient Near Eastern culture, the word machashava carried connotations of skilled craftsmanship. It was used to describe the detailed planning that went into major construction projects, the careful design that preceded the creation of beautiful artwork, the strategic thinking that guided military campaigns. When God uses this word to describe his plans, he's not talking about vague good intentions. He's talking about specific, detailed, carefully crafted purposes. The word for prosper is shalom, but it doesn't mean financial success or material blessing. Shalom is one of the richest words in the Hebrew language, encompassing wholeness, completeness, harmony, peace, and well-being in every dimension of life. It describes the state of things when they are functioning according to God's design, when relationships are healthy, when justice prevails, when creation itself reflects the character of its creator. Shalom is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of right relationships. It's not the absence of challenge, but the presence of resources to meet those challenges. It's not the absence of change, but the presence of stability that can weather any storm. When God promises shalom, he's promising something far deeper than circumstances. He's promising a way of being in the world that transcends circumstances. And the phrase hope and a future literally means an expected end or a future with hope. The Hebrew word for hope, tikvah, comes from a root that means to wait or to expect. It's not wishful thinking. It's confident expectation based on the character and promises of God. The Hebrew word for future, acharit, refers not just to any future, but to the ultimate outcome, the final chapter, the completion of God's purposes. This promise was not about the immediate future, but about the ultimate future. God was telling the exiles that their current suffering was not the end of the story, that their present circumstances were not the final word, that their individual lives were part of a larger narrative that would ultimately demonstrate his goodness and faithfulness. But here's what makes this promise so remarkable. God wasn't offering to change their circumstances to give them hope. He was offering to give them hope within their circumstances. Now we come to the heart of what Jeremiah 9:11 really means, and why our modern understanding has missed something so crucial. When we use this verse today, we typically apply it individually and immediately. We take it as God's personal promise that he has good plans for my life, my career, my relationships, my dreams. We use it as a guarantee against suffering, a divine insurance policy that ensures our lives will work out the way we hope. This individualistic interpretation reflects our modern Western worldview more than it reflects the biblical worldview. In our culture, we think primarily in terms of individual rights, personal fulfillment, and private relationship with God. We naturally read the Bible through this lens, assuming that God's primary concern is our individual happiness and success. But the biblical worldview is fundamentally communal. God's promises are typically made to communities, to the nation of Israel, to the church, to the people of God as a whole. Individual lives find their meaning not in isolation, but as part of the larger community story. Personal fulfillment is not the ultimate goal. Participation in God's purposes is. But that's not what this verse is saying at all. First, this promise was made to a community, not to individuals. The you in Hebrew is plural throughout Jeremiah's letter. God wasn't making a personal promise to each exile that their individual life would turn out wonderfully. He was making a covenant promise to the Jewish people as a whole that his purposes for them would ultimately be fulfilled. This distinction is crucial because it changes how we understand God's faithfulness. When we read this verse individually, we expect God to ensure that our personal lives unfold according to our preferences. When we understand it communally, we trust that God's larger purposes will be accomplished even when individual lives include suffering, loss, and apparent defeat. Many of those exiles died in Babylon. They never saw their homeland again. Their individual stories included suffering, loss, grief, and death in a foreign land. But God's promise wasn't about their individual comfort. It was about His faithfulness to His covenant people across generations. Consider someone like Daniel, one of the first exiles taken to Babylon. He lived virtually his entire adult life in exile, serving in the courts of foreign kings, never returning to Jerusalem. From an individual perspective, he might have seemed to miss out on God's promise of restoration. But from a communal perspective, Daniel's life was instrumental in preserving Jewish faith during the exile and in demonstrating God's sovereignty to pagan rulers. Or consider Ezekiel, who prophesied to the exiles in Babylon and died there without ever returning home. His individual story did not include the restoration he prophesied about, but his ministry was crucial in preparing the exilic community for their eventual return and in developing a theology that could sustain faith in the absence of the temple. Second, this promise wasn't about immediate relief, but about ultimate purpose. The 70 years of exile weren't a mistake or a deviation from God's plan. They were part of God's plan. The suffering wasn't evidence that God had abandoned them. It was evidence that God was working through even their deepest pain to accomplish something they couldn't yet understand. The exile served multiple purposes in God's larger plan. It purged the Jewish people of their tendency toward idolatry. After the exile, they never again struggled with worshiping foreign gods as they had throughout their pre-exilic history. This wasn't a minor accomplishment. Idolatry had been the persistent defining sin that had led to their destruction. The exile broke this pattern completely and permanently. The exile also prepared them to be a light to the nations as they learned to maintain their faith while living among foreigners. In Jerusalem, the Jewish people had been largely isolated from other cultures, able to maintain their distinct identity through separation. In exile, they had to learn how to be faithful to God while fully engaged with foreign cultures. This experience prepared them for their eventual role as a diaspora people who would carry their faith throughout the ancient world. The exile deepened their understanding of God's character as they discovered He wasn't confined to the temple in Jerusalem, but was present with them even in Babylon. This theological breakthrough was enormous. It meant that God was not merely a national deity tied to a particular land, but the universal Lord who ruled over all nations and was present in all places. The exile also forced them to develop new forms of religious practice that were not dependent on the temple. They learned to pray without sacrifices, to worship without priests, to maintain their identity without the external supports they had always relied on. This development of what would become synagogue worship and rabbinic Judaism was crucial for the survival of their faith through subsequent persecutions and dispersions. Most importantly, the exile was preparing the way for the Messiah. The genealogies in Matthew and Luke both trace Jesus' lineage through people whose lives were shaped by the exile. The theological insights that emerged from the exile period influenced the Jewish worldview that Jesus would later fulfill and transform. The prophet Isaiah, writing during the exile, developed the concept of the suffering servant, a figure who would bear the sins of others, who would be pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. This theology of redemptive suffering, born out of the exile experience, provided the framework for understanding Jesus' death and resurrection. The prophet Ezekiel, also writing during the exile, envisioned a new covenant in which God would give his people new hearts and put his spirit within them. This vision of internal transformation, rather than external conformity to law, became central to New Testament theology. Daniel's apocalyptic visions, received during the exile, provided the conceptual framework for understanding God's ultimate victory over evil and the establishment of his eternal kingdom. Jesus drew heavily on Daniel's imagery in his own teaching about the kingdom of heaven. Here's the revolutionary truth. God's good plans for the exiles included their suffering. Not despite their suffering, not around their suffering, but through their suffering. The 70 years of exile weren't an unfortunate detour from God's good plans. They were God's good plans. This doesn't mean God caused their suffering arbitrarily or that he delights in human pain. The exile was a consequence of generations of covenant unfaithfulness, a natural result of the choices the Jewish people had made. God's laws included clear warnings about the consequences of disobedience, and the exile was the fulfillment of those warnings. But even in that consequence, even in that judgment, God was working to accomplish something beautiful. He was using the painful results of their choices to teach them lessons they could not have learned any other way, to prepare them for purposes they could not have fulfilled otherwise, to give them a hope and a future that was far greater than what they had lost. The Hebrew understanding of God's goodness is far more complex than our modern conception. We tend to think of God's goodness as meaning he gives us what we want, protects us from what we fear, and ensures our lives are comfortable and successful. But the Hebrew understanding of God's goodness is that he does whatever is necessary to accomplish his ultimate purposes for our ultimate good, even when that process involves temporary suffering. This understanding is reflected throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. Joseph's brothers meant their actions for evil when they sold him into slavery, but God meant it for good to save many lives. Job's suffering was not evidence of God's absence, but of God's confidence in Job's faith. David's years as a fugitive were not wasted time, but preparation for kingship. When God promised the exiles that he had plans to prosper them and not to harm them, he wasn't promising them an easy life. He was promising them that their suffering would not be meaningless, that their story was part of a larger story, that their pain would ultimately serve a purpose they couldn't yet see. The Hebrew concept of not to harm doesn't mean the absence of difficult circumstances, but the absence of ultimate destruction. God was promising that he would not allow their suffering to destroy them, that he would not permit their exile to end in extinction, that he would not let their story conclude in meaninglessness. So what does this mean for us today? How do we apply Jeremiah 29:11 when we understand what it actually says? First, it means we can stop using this verse as a magical formula for getting the life we want. God never promised any of us that following him would lead to material prosperity, career success, or personal happiness as the world defines it. He never promised that our individual stories would unfold according to our preferences, or that we would be exempt from suffering. The prosperity gospel and its variations have done tremendous damage to Christian faith by creating expectations that God never intended to fulfill. When believers expect God to ensure their financial success, protect them from all hardship, and arrange their circumstances according to their preferences, they inevitably face a crisis of faith when reality doesn't match their expectations. This crisis is often compounded by well-meaning Christians who quote Jeremiah 29:11 as evidence that God has wonderful plans for every individual life, plans that will result in happiness, success, and fulfillment as the world defines these things. When life includes seasons of struggle, disappointment, and loss, as every life does, these believers conclude either that they must be doing something wrong or that God must not be as good as they thought. But, and this is crucial, that doesn't make God's promise less powerful. It makes it infinitely more powerful. When we understand that God's good plans might include seasons of exile, periods of waiting, experiences of loss, and times of confusion, we can find hope even in our darkest moments. We don't have to pretend that our suffering isn't real, minimize our pain, or paste on false smiles and claim that everything is wonderful when it clearly isn't. This understanding provides a much more robust foundation for faith. Instead of expecting God to shield us from all difficulty, we can trust Him to work through our difficulties. Instead of demanding that He change our circumstances to match our preferences, we can ask Him to change us to match His purposes. Instead of measuring His love by our comfort, we can measure His love by His faithfulness to His ultimate plans. Instead, we can trust that God is working through our circumstances, all of them, even the ones we wouldn't choose, to accomplish purposes we can't yet see. We can believe that our story is part of a larger story, that our pain is not meaningless, that even our most difficult seasons are serving God's ultimate plans. Think about the single mother working 3 jobs to provide for her children. She goes to bed exhausted every night, worries constantly about making ends meet, and feels guilty that she can't spend more time with her kids. The traditional interpretation of Jeremiah 29:11 might lead her to expect that God will send a wealthy husband, provide a better job, or somehow make her financial struggles disappear. But the real promise of Jeremiah 29:11 is far more profound. It doesn't promise her that God will send a wealthy husband or a lottery win, but it does promise her that her sacrifice, her struggle, her faithfulness in difficult circumstances is part of God's larger purpose. It promises her that her story matters, that her children are watching her demonstrate faith under pressure, that her character is being shaped in ways that will impact generations. Her children are learning from her example that love means sacrifice, that responsibility means perseverance, that faith means trusting God even when life is hard. They're developing resilience, empathy, and appreciation for what they have. They're being prepared for challenges in their own lives by watching how their mother handles challenges in hers. Moreover, her situation may be preparing her for purposes she can't yet imagine. Perhaps her experience of financial struggle will give her unique credibility when she later mentors other single mothers. Perhaps her children will be drawn to careers in social service because of what they learned from her example. Perhaps her testimony of God's faithfulness through hardship will encourage others who face similar challenges. Consider the young professional who thought they were called to ministry but ended up in a corporate job they hate. They feel like they're wasting their life, like they've missed God's calling, like their dreams of serving Him have been derailed by economic necessity or family obligations. The traditional interpretation of Jeremiah 29:11 might lead them to expect that God will open ministry doors, provide the resources to attend seminary, or create the circumstances that will allow them to pursue their original calling. When these things don't happen, they might conclude that God doesn't really have good plans for them after all. But the real promise of Jeremiah 29:11 is different. It doesn't promise them that God will open ministry doors next month, but it does promise them that their current season of exile, feeling like they're in the wrong place, longing for something different, is not outside God's plan. It promises them that God is using this time to teach them about business, about relating to non-Christians, about depending on Him when life doesn't match their expectations. Their corporate experience may be giving them skills, insights, and relationships that will make them far more effective ministers when God does open those doors. Their frustration with secular work may be developing in them a heart for other believers who feel trapped in unfulfilling jobs. Their financial struggles may be teaching them empathy for the economic pressures that most of their future congregation will face. Moreover, their current workplace may be their actual mission field. Perhaps God has placed them in that company not as punishment or mistake, but as His representative to people who would never darken the door of a church. Perhaps their witness in the workplace, their integrity in business dealings, their compassion for co-workers is exactly the ministry God wants them to pursue right now. Think about the couple struggling with infertility. They've prayed for years, tried every medical option, and watched as friends and family members easily conceive while they remain childless. The traditional interpretation of Jeremiah 29:11 might lead them to believe that God's good plans must include giving them the children they desperately want. But the real promise of Jeremiah 29:11 doesn't promise them that their circumstances will change according to their timeline. Instead, it promises them that their story is held within God's larger story, that their pain is not forgotten, that their future is secure even when they can't see it. Their struggle with infertility may be developing in them a depth of compassion that will make them uniquely qualified to help other couples facing similar challenges. Their experience of disappointed hopes may be teaching them to find their identity in God rather than in their circumstances. Their journey through grief may be preparing them to comfort others who face different but equally devastating losses. Perhaps God will ultimately bless them with children through conception, adoption, or other means. But perhaps their calling is to pour their parental love into other people's children through teaching, mentoring, or ministry. Perhaps their childlessness will give them freedoms and opportunities for service that they wouldn't otherwise have. Perhaps their testimony of finding hope and purpose despite unfulfilled longings will encourage others who face different but equally painful disappointments. Consider the college student battling depression. They struggle to get out of bed, have difficulty concentrating on studies, and feel hopeless about the future. The traditional interpretation of Jeremiah 29:11 might lead them to expect that God will simply remove their depression, restore their emotional health, and give them a bright and happy future. But the real promise of Jeremiah 29:11 is more complex and ultimately more hopeful. It doesn't promise that their depression will disappear overnight, but it does promise that even their mental health struggles are held within God's larger purposes, that their pain is not meaningless, that their future can include hope even if it also includes ongoing challenges. Their battle with depression may be teaching them empathy for others who struggle with mental health issues. Their experience of darkness may be preparing them to guide others toward light. Their journey through therapy, medication, and recovery may be equipping them to help break down the stigma surrounding mental illness in Christian communities. Moreover, many of the most effective counselors, pastors, and mental health advocates have personal experience with depression, anxiety, or other mental health challenges. Their struggle is not an obstacle to their calling. It may be preparation for their calling. Think about the elderly person facing declining health. They're losing independence, dealing with chronic pain, and watching their bodies betray them in ways that are frustrating and frightening. The traditional interpretation of Jeremiah 29:11 might lead them to pray for healing, expect miraculous recovery, or assume that God's good plans must include restored health. But the real promise of Jeremiah 29:11 acknowledges that aging and mortality are part of the human experience that God works through rather than simply eliminating. It doesn't promise physical healing, but it does promise that even declining health can serve God's purposes, that even the aging process can contribute to His larger plans. Their experience of limitation may be teaching them to depend on God in ways they never had to before. Their acceptance of mortality may be developing in them a perspective on what really matters that they can share with younger people. Their graceful handling of aging may be giving their children and grandchildren a model for how to face their own inevitable limitations. Moreover, many elderly people find that their most significant ministry happens not despite their limitations, but because of them. Their availability, their perspective, their freedom from many of life's pressures can make them uniquely effective as mentors, intercessors, and wisdom givers. This is actually a far more profound promise than what we thought we had. A God who promises us only good circumstances is a God who is limited by our definition of good. A God who promises to work through all circumstances, including the ones we wouldn't choose, is a God whose power transcends our understanding and whose love is deeper than our pain. The real promise of Jeremiah 29:11 is not that we will avoid exile, but that even in exile, we are not abandoned. The real promise is not that we will never suffer, but that our suffering is not meaningless. The real promise is not that our individual stories will all have happy endings, but that our individual stories are part of a cosmic story that will have the ultimate happy ending. When Jesus came, he embodied this understanding of Jeremiah 29:11. His life included rejection, misunderstanding, suffering, and death. But through that very suffering, he accomplished God's ultimate plan for human redemption. His exile from heaven, his season of limitation in human flesh, his experience of the cross, all of it was part of God's good plans to give humanity hope and a future. Jesus' life perfectly illustrates how God's good plans can include what appears to be defeat and disaster. From a human perspective, Jesus' crucifixion looked like the ultimate failure. His disciples fled. His mission seemed to have ended in shame. His claims appeared to have been disproven by his helplessness on the cross. But from God's perspective, the cross was not the failure of the plan. It was the culmination of the plan. Through Jesus' death, God accomplished what could not have been accomplished any other way. The payment for human sin, the defeat of death, the reconciliation of God and humanity. What looked like God's ultimate defeat was actually his ultimate victory. Jesus' teachings consistently reflected this understanding. He told his disciples that they would face persecution, that following him would involve taking up their cross, that in this world they would have trouble. But he also promised that he had overcome the world, that their suffering would not be meaningless, that their faithfulness in the midst of difficulty would contribute to his ultimate victory. The Apostle Paul caught this vision and articulated it throughout his letters. He wrote about sharing in Christ's sufferings, about the fellowship of his suffering, about the way that our present sufferings are producing in us an eternal weight of glory. Paul understood that his imprisonments, beatings, and hardships were not obstacles to his ministry, but part of his ministry. As followers of Jesus, we're called to embrace this same understanding. Our individual comfort is not God's highest priority. Our personal happiness is not his ultimate goal. His highest priority and ultimate goal is the demonstration of his glory and the accomplishment of his purposes through our lives, whatever that may require. This doesn't mean God is indifferent to our pain or callous about our struggles. It means that he loves us too much to leave us unchanged, that he values our character more than our comfort, that he is committed to our ultimate good, even when that process involves temporary difficulty. This means we can face uncertainty with confidence, not because we know how our story will end, but because we know who is writing our story. We can endure suffering with hope, not because we know it will end quickly, but because we know it will not be wasted. We can embrace seasons of waiting, seasons of exile, seasons of confusion, because we trust that God is using even these to prepare us for something we cannot yet imagine. This perspective transforms how we pray. Instead of primarily asking God to change our circumstances, we can ask him to change us through our circumstances. Instead of demanding that He remove our difficulties, we can ask Him to use our difficulties for His purposes. Instead of measuring His faithfulness by how He answers our prayers, we can measure His faithfulness by how He works through both answered and unanswered prayers. This perspective also transforms how we encourage others. Instead of offering shallow promises that everything will work out fine, we can offer the deeper promise that nothing is wasted in God's economy. Instead of trying to explain away people's pain, we can sit with them in their pain and remind them that their story is part of a larger story. Instead of pressuring people to get over their struggles quickly, we can encourage them to let their struggles do their work of forming character and building faith. As we conclude our journey into the real meaning of Jeremiah 29:11, I want you to consider how much more beautiful this promise becomes when we understand what it actually says. The God who spoke to the Jewish exiles in Babylon is the same God who speaks to us today. He has not changed. His character has not shifted. His purposes have not been thwarted. He is still the God who works through all things, including the things we wouldn't choose, to accomplish His good plans. Those exiles in Babylon did eventually return to Jerusalem, just as God promised. 70 years later, under leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah, they rebuilt the temple, restored the walls, and re-established worship in the holy city. But they returned as different people than they had been when they left. The exile had changed them, matured them, prepared them for the purposes God had in mind. The return from exile wasn't just a restoration of what had been lost. It was the beginning of something new. The Second Temple period saw developments in Jewish theology, worship, and community life that would never have occurred without the exile experience. The synagogue system, rabbinic scholarship, and diaspora communities all emerged from the exile and became crucial elements in God's plan for reaching the world. More importantly, their story became part of the preparation for the coming of the Messiah. Jesus was born into a world shaped by the exile, to a people who had learned through suffering to hope for God's ultimate deliverance. The very pain that the exiles experienced became part of the foundation for the salvation that would eventually be offered to the world. The theological insights that emerged from the exile, the universality of God's reign, the possibility of worship without the temple, the hope for a new covenant, all became central themes in Jesus' teaching and the New Testament's understanding of the gospel. The exile wasn't just something God's people survived. It was something God used to prepare them for their ultimate calling. Your story, too, is part of something larger than you can see. Your struggles, your waiting, your seasons of confusion and pain. None of it is outside God's awareness or beyond His ability to use for good. You may be in your own Babylon right now, feeling far from home, wondering if God has forgotten you, questioning whether His promises are true. Let me remind you of who your God is. He is the God who enters into exile with His people. When the Jewish exiles were in Babylon, God was there with them. When Jesus was on the cross, God was there suffering with Him. When you are in your darkest valley, God is there walking beside you. He is the God who weeps with those who weep, who is near to the brokenhearted, who never leaves you or forsakes you. He is the God who never wastes pain, never ignores suffering, never abandons His children even when they feel most alone. Every tear you've shed is precious to Him. Every struggle you've faced has been noticed by Him. Every prayer you've prayed has been heard by Him, even when the answer doesn't come in the form you expected. He is also the God whose plans span generations, whose purposes transcend individual circumstances, whose love is so deep that He will allow temporary suffering to accomplish eternal good. He is playing a long game that we can't fully comprehend, working toward goals that are bigger than our individual preferences, pursuing purposes that will ultimately vindicate His character and demonstrate His glory. He is the God who sent His own Son into exile, from heaven to earth, from glory to humility, from life to death, so that our ultimate future could be secure. Jesus' willing embrace of exile, suffering, and death opened the way for us to have hope that transcends any earthly circumstance. Because He was willing to be forsaken, we never will be. Because He endured the ultimate exile, our current exiles are temporary. The promise of Jeremiah 29:11 is not that your individual life will be easy or comfortable or successful by worldly standards. The promise is that your life, with all its joys and sorrows, triumphs and struggles, certainties and questions, is held securely within God's good purposes. You may not return from your exile as quickly as you hope. The single mother may continue working multiple jobs for years. The aspiring minister may spend decades in corporate work. The couple struggling with infertility may never have biological children. The student battling depression may face ongoing mental health challenges. The elderly person may continue to experience declining health. You may not see the fulfillment of God's promises in your lifetime. Like many of the exiles in Babylon, you may die before experiencing the restoration you long for. You may not understand how your struggles fit into God's larger plan. You may never see the good that God brings out of your pain. But you can trust that He knows the plans He has for you, that those plans are good, and that they will ultimately give you hope and a future that transcends anything you could ask or imagine. You can trust that your story matters, that your faithfulness in difficult circumstances contributes to His ultimate purposes, that your individual narrative is part of a cosmic story that will have the most glorious ending imaginable. The God who kept His promise to the exiles in Babylon will keep His promises to you, not necessarily in the way you expect, not necessarily on your timeline, but always in the way that serves His ultimate purposes and demonstrates His ultimate love. That's the real promise of Jeremiah 29:11. That's the verse that could change everything, not because it guarantees us the life we want, but because it guarantees us something infinitely better, a life that matters, a story that counts, a future that is secure in the hands of the God who loves us enough to use even our exile for our ultimate good. Trust Him, even when you can't see where He's leading, even when the path doesn't make sense, even when you feel far from home. Trust Him, because His plans for you are good, and His love for you is the one thing in this uncertain world that will never, ever change. And remember this, the same God who brought the exiles home to Jerusalem after 70 years is the same God who will one day bring all His people home to the new Jerusalem, where there will be no more tears, no more pain, no more exile, no more separation. Your current struggles are temporary. Your future hope is eternal, and the one who holds that future in His hands has never failed to keep a promise.